Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, good night to wherever you are, to the audience who have just tuned in to this webinar. Welcome to this webinar on the place of freedom of religion or belief in fostering social inclusion, peace, and peaceful coexistence in ASEAN. This webinar is sponsored by the Southeast Asia Freedom of Religion and or Belief Network. It is a network, and my name is Eugene Yap, and I'm joined together this session with Professor Ko Durham, who is my co-organizer for this event. The two of us represents a member organization in the Southeast Asia Freedom of Religion and Belief Network. I represent the Religious Freedom Institute, and Ko represents the International Center for Law and Religion Studies. Those who have registered in this webinar will be able to submit the written question using the Q&A function on your computer. Unfortunately, the whole setup is designed in such a way that you can only do so, submit your questions through the Q&A function, not through audible means. That's something that more because of the technical aspect. But you will have plenty of opportunity, ample opportunity to throw your questions at any time during this webinar. Just type in the Q&A function, and the questions will appear before the speakers, and the speakers will have the opportunity to respond to your questions. The panelists will be given given time to have their opening statement, followed by a few rounds of questions posted by me. And then after the whole exercise is completed with the speakers, then they will look into the questions that you have or you have written, and then we will then have this interactive session. Now, this session is designed in such a way to be as interactive in an informal, casual kind of conversation. So feel free to post your questions, and we really do look forward to the questions coming from you. Just for you to note, this session is also live streamed through YouTube, although those who are watching through YouTube will not be able to post their questions because they are not registered, but they will be able to what you call view the whole event through the YouTube. So there will be a link that will be present, that will be provided, and you can actually send that link to anyone who may be interested to follow the event, not if they have not registered for the Zoom in the pre-registration earlier. So I'm not sure, Ko, is the link to the YouTube already there?
I'm having some technical difficulty getting the YouTube thing started, so I will post it in the chat as soon as I have it. So
okay, thank you. Okay, so by way of announcement, just to a bit of a heads up for those who may be interested, there will be also another webinar that is similarly organized by the SEAFoRB Network, Southeast Asia Freedom of Religion or Belief Network, that try to address the issues on Vietnam and Laos. So if anyone out there who's interested on the situation in Vietnam and Laos, we have another webinar. This is at 10 p.m. Malaysian time. So it's the title is on the struggles of organized religion in inherently anti-religious regime, the case of Vietnam and Laos. So that's for anyone who be interested. So allow me to just give you some introduction regarding the SEAFoRB network. This is the organizers of this webinar. The SEAFoRB network, otherwise known as the Southeast Asia Freedom of Religion or Belief Network, was first a conference that was organized by several organizations, namely the BPSOS, Forum Asia, the International Commission of Jurists, and together with the special assistance from the former UN Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Religion, Professor Heiner Benefeld, they convened a conference in 2015. And from that conference, we have several other conferences as a follow-up. And through those conferences, eventually the participants of those conferences decided that we must establish a network. So that's a little bit of an introduction how SEAFoRB came to be a network. Since then, we have also what you call created or drafted sort of like a declaration, and that declaration consists of core principles and belief that sort of govern this SEAFoRB network. So that charter is otherwise known as the Bangkok Declaration. So and through that Bangkok Declaration and the conferences that they have, we were able to bring in FoRB advocates, human rights organizations, religious communities, religious leaders, governmental representative, parliamentarians, and even non-governmental organizations, international non-governmental organizations, UN officials and academics to share, to connect together, and to plan joint actions for the right of freedom of religion and belief. However, due to the COVID pandemic this year all over the world, we could not hold our annual conferences, which happens around this time in November. So we have decided to host a series of webinars. So we have already done what you call 2 webinars. The first webinar was held sometime in September, which was entitled Peace Building and Conflict Resolution Across Inter-Religious Lines, organized by CSW. And then the second webinar was on coronavirus and its impact on human rights and FoRB, freedom of religion and belief, organized by the Asean Parliamentarian for Human Rights in cooperation with the IPP FoRB, International Panel of Parliamentarians and Stephanus Alliance. So that's the 2 earlier webinars that have actually been held. Today's webinar is actually a second of a series of the on the theme of religion and development. We had hosted part one of this 2-part series last week, last Tuesday, with Catherine Marshall, Brian Grimm, and Alyssa Wahid on the issues and challenges when bringing religion or FoRB to the development agenda. So they actually spoke and shared about more generally what are the issues confronting the theme of religion and development. So today we are going to dwell into a little bit more specific on the subject of SDG number 16, the UN Agenda 2030 SDG 16. And this afternoon or this morning or this evening, wherever you are, we are intending to explore the nexus or interrelatedness between freedom of religion or belief with the UN Agenda 2030 on Sustainable Development Goal, in particular SDG number 16 on peaceful, just, and inclusive society. So that's where we are coming from for this particular webinar. Now, what this webinar is going to focus is on 2 areas. We are going to explore ideas and ways on 2 main areas. Number 1, we are going to see how religion or freedom of religion or belief may contribute or foster peaceful society, harmonious relation, and religious diversity. That's 1. Number 2, we are also going to explore ideas and ways in which to see how religion or freedom of religion or belief may create the environment that is necessary to meet the welfare and well-being of all people, in particular the marginalized people and communities, the religious minorities, the poor, those in poverty, targeted minorities such as the refugees, displaced person, or disadvantaged group. This has become a very prevalent theme, especially during this season where COVID-19 and the pandemic has struck the people all over the world. So, and we have very distinguished panels of speakers before us. So I do hope that each and every one of you will enjoy and benefit from this webinar in ways that will be appropriate to you. So that's it for introduction. As I said, this webinar is designed to be informal, more like a talk show kind of style, casual. Please, once again, fill in your questions through the Q&A mechanism there, and then just write your question and the speakers will take your question. So with that introduction, we want to now invite our first speaker to address us. After she addresses, we will I will pose several questions and then the interaction will start. First on the list is Professor Azhar Karam, now the Secretary General for the Global Organization Religion for Peace International. Now, Azhar is no stranger to the global community as well as the UN community. The Religion for Peace International is now known as the largest multi-religious leadership platform with 19 national and 6 regional inter-religious councils. So Azza heads that. And she's also a professor of religion and development at the FoRB University. Did I get that right, Azza? In Amsterdam. And she also served as the senior advisor on culture at the United Nations Population Fund and as coordinator chair of the United Nations Interagency Task Force on Religion and Development, where she coordinates engagement with members of a global interfaith network with over 600 faith-based organizations. So she's really a huge figure in this discussion. So without further ado, the floor is yours, Azza. Please speak to us and enlighten us.
Thank you very much indeed, Dr. Eugene, and thank you very much, Professor Durham. It's always a pleasure to be able to serve in the same space with you. And I'm very grateful, Eugene, for that framing that you gave of this whole entire process. Also very grateful to Cole for being an erstwhile champion of FoRB issues in so many different fora and of the interreligious collaboration in particular. So it's always a delight and a privilege to be with you here. I wanted to begin by just actually noting that I'm going to be deliberately provocative. Not so much informative, but perhaps provocative with a view to trying to also inform together and think together. The first thing that I would say is that I think we injure ourselves seriously by looking at FoRB as freedom of religion and belief outside of the frame of what it is in Article 18 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is freedom of thought, conscience, and belief. I think to have somehow zeroed in on the belief part means that we've excised very critical and interlocking elements of this particular belief notion, or the notion of belief, and especially of the freedom that we're trying to assert and realize, which is that it's also freedom of thought and conscience. And why are those important and integral to the notion of freedom of belief? Because quite frankly, you cannot expect anyone to be respectful of a belief without understanding the implications of the that belief, of the antithesis of that belief, or the process of development of a conscience that then is also and may also be in direct opposition to a belief. So the freedom of thought, conscience, and belief is meant to be the freedom to respect those who believe, those who deny beliefs, but those who also have a very distinct set of ways of thinking that fall outside of traditional belief systems. And it's meant to be a freedom of thought, which positions us in such a way that we would not have to only believe, but it is also what we think about beliefs and what we understand conscience to be. That is a realm of spirit that is way beyond what we understand as religions today. So we actually narrow down the freedom that is intended by thought, conscience, and belief. We narrow it down, we excise critical elements of what is needed in order to safeguard freedom of belief. We excise critical elements of the freedoms that have to be fought for simultaneously and in an interlocking manner. So I think we all agree on what we essentially mean by freedom of religion and belief, but I think that we are not approaching it very smartly when we excise thought and conscience as part of that process of struggle for the freedoms and assertion for it. So that's my first provocative note. I have 3 more. The second provocative note that I think is important for us to, in a way, to stimulate some of our thinking is that we've done such a fine job over the last 10, 15 years of positioning for freedom of religion and belief as a key policy agenda issue, largely in the Western Hemisphere. So the work you're doing, Eugene, is extremely critical because it helps us balance a little bit that over influence, that particular perceptive attitude, which in my opinion is a very post-colonial attitude or neo-colonial attitude, whereby FoRB seems to be an arena that needs to be carved out and served on its own and not necessarily clearly connected to the rest of the human rights agenda. Not necessarily clear why FoRB or freedom of religion and belief, is of vital importance for the other freedoms and human rights issues. So it's almost as if it's FoRB at the expense of other human rights, and we can select and zero in on FoRB as governments or civil society when we realize actually that we might not be realizing the other set of human rights. So is FoRB more significant than other human rights? And this, by the way, is a problem of international development, international organizations, international foreign policy in general. The zeroing in and the cherry picking of certain human rights that then have to become the end all and be all of a particular set of narratives or struggles or mobilization or what have you. We zero in on specific rights in order to ensure that we can help realize them. Of course, the reasons are absolutely magnanimous and fantastic, but the point is that we lose sight of the interconnectedness and of one key element and aspect of human rights, which is the indivisibility of human rights. That to cherry pick, to zero, to put so much resources and attention into one area of rights, actually, again, in the same way that we're doing with the ignoring thought and conscience, this time we're actually ignoring, or at the very minimum, we're glossing over the interconnectedness between this particular right and the rest of the human rights agenda. And that we cannot realize FoRB in a vacuum of human rights. We cannot realize FoRB in a vacuum of the other human rights. Every single human right that we must be struggling for is interdependent and indivisible and universal. To zero in on FoRB is understandable for a short while, but in the long term, that continued zeroing in and cherry picking on FoRB is actually harmful to the entire human rights agenda. That's the second point. The third point I want to say is that we're obviously operating in a context of COVID, and COVID is not just a temporal thing. COVID is a result of a series of, I would say, catastrophes that we have committed as governance and civic mechanisms, which is to ignore our environmental health for the longest possible reason. And because we have ignored our environment, and because we've politicized our environmental concerns, we've ended up in a place where humanitarian crises, natural humanitarian crises, are going to be a much more regular phenomenon. COVID is a transmission that could have been prevented a long time ago had we not destroyed and continue to destroy natural habitats of different animals. By so doing, by destroying the natural habitats of different species, we have increased the preponderance of transmission of different diseases from certain living species to humans. This is not stopping at COVID. We're only seeing the beginning of the harm that we are doing to our health as a result of the harm that we are doing to the environmental and climate health. So what does that mean? It means that we're at a moment now where, because we've cherry-picked certain human rights for so long, we've forgotten the larger environment we live in, or we seem to think that's somebody else's job to defend it. We now are all paying that price. The consequence of this COVID disaster that we're all living through is that authoritarian regimes, and those who quite frankly don't deserve to be democratic but seem to think that they are, that all authoritarianism is on the rise. We are not simply referring to extremism, political extremism, or violent extremism of certain religious groups in certain parts of the world. We are talking about a rise in the violence of regimes globally, governmental and non-governmental. So effectively, authoritarianism has become the new normal in governance regimes globally. That means that marginalization is normal. That means that what we were complaining about just a year or two ago of certain groups being marginalized extensively, that's now become the normal. More marginalization happens under authoritarianism than ever before. So thanks to our focusing in on specific rights, ignoring the interconnectedness and interdivisibility, and trying to therefore not see how the larger picture harms each and every one of us, we're now living in a situation where we can't argue for human rights anymore. We've destroyed the fabric of the argument of human rights by cherry picking at different aspects of it. So authoritarian regimes no longer feel obligated as they would have been before. And as we've struggled for decades to try to make many regimes obligated to the entire human rights agenda, so now with COVID, we're stuck with authoritarianism as the normal. That means marginalization, including marginalization of religious minorities, but also of gender and many other groups. That marginalization is our new normal. How do we think we can possibly argue for FoRB in a new normal, which is where all of the marginalized are becoming more marginalized? And even those who are suffering greater degrees of poverty and therefore marginalization are increasing in number. What FoRB are we talking about? And my fourth and last contentious point is this. We speak about FoRB, we talk for FoRB, we advocate for FoRB. We have superb parliamentary exercises, civil society networks, all organized around FoRB. We seem to have forgotten that the primary champions of religious freedom and the freedom of thought and conscience and belief, that the primary champions should be religious institutions. Religious institutions, which are part of civil society, but very often believe themselves to be exceptions to the civic norm. Religious institutions should be the primary bearers, rights bearers of freedom of thought, conscience, and belief, because theirs is the discourse, the narrative that ultimately explains whether it's the freedom and how we will achieve it, or whether it's not. And ultimately, the discourse of marginalization of religious minorities actually originates from religious institutions, or is either condoned openly or condoned by turning a blind eye. So religious institutions have a very critical role to play in upholding freedom of thought, conscience, and belief. But here I am working within Religions for Peace with all the religious institutions of the world represented, and realizing that everyone else in the FoRB sphere, which has expanded significantly over the last few years, that everyone else in the FoRB sphere is very busy doing their own little thing, but the religious institutions are largely out of that frame of reference and accountability for freedom of thought, conscience, and belief. These religious institutions need to be supported, to be in a way empowered, to be champions, for it to be even understood what it means to champion not the freedom of your own belief that you as an institution stand for, but the freedom of the thought, conscience, and beliefs of others that are not part of your own institution. That awareness, that deliberation, that accountability has yet to be part of the frame of engagement on FoRB. And it must be, and it cannot be only on freedom of religion and belief, it must be on freedom of thought, conscience, and belief. Those are my points. I have many more, but that's enough for now. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Azza. So you weren't kidding when you say that you want to be provocative. So I think she has brought in very good points. There are many questions I think we can ask, but for the sake of time and also to allow our audience to also throw their question, I will just center on one question so that you can clarify further on the 4 points that you made that are contentious, provocative. You went as far as to use the word neo-colonialism, because we are all from Asia, so we are all colonized, including Egypt and all the kind of thing. So that's really provocative, and I like that. I like that. But my question to you, Azza, is this: why do you think that we have this, so to speak, atomization? That's for one of a better word. We atomize a particular right. We exclude or excise other rights as unimportant, or we categorize or prioritize some rights are more important than others, and so on. And so that's why human rights become divisible, and it becomes we don't see it as interrelated. So in your opinion, why has this state of affair comes? Is it because we don't see the whole is made up of a part, and the part contributes to the whole? I mean, from an Aristotelian philosophy point of view, the parts always made up the whole, and the whole is without a whole, without a part. So why do you think, in your opinion, this state of affair where begin to narrow, excise away thought and conscience. We only want to look at freedom of religion and no other human rights. And then as a result of it, the authoritarian kind of a regime and state of affairs actually come about. Maybe you'd like to comment a little bit on this.
Sure.
Can I just break in and just add to that question, because well, I'm sympathetic to what you're saying in many respects. My sense is that, you know, as I've experienced the field, one of the reasons that people have been aggressively defending FoRB, and it has been coming from religious institutions, is because it's been often systematically left out of human rights discourse. So I would have to say what really happened, the reason behind, for example, the US International Religious Freedom Act was a sense that as human rights workers in foreign ministries and the UN and other places were working on things, they would work on all kinds of other things, and freedom of religion or belief was systematically left out of account. And so that if you really wanted to have a holistic approach, you needed to put some special emphasis behind it because it was systematically being left out. Now, that doesn't mean, it could be that there's been an overcorrection, but maybe you could take that into account in answering Eugene's question.
Yes, thank you, Cole. I think that that's a very critical reminder of how, by the way, in this case, you've described the FoRB emphasis. But if you look at gender equality, it has a similar, exactly a similar nuance. You know, we had years of looking at certain rights and totally ignoring gender and gender equality and women's empowerment. And then it took decades of focus and refocus and now we have a situation where nobody's going to say openly, no, we don't really think women should be equal to men in anything at all in life. And you know, that therefore we've kind of normalized the equality argument and narrative. We haven't realized it, by the way, and therein is a very, very critical lesson for those of us arguing for freedom of thought, conscience, and belief. Because if we look at the trajectory of what has happened with gender equality, we should learn a couple of things. One of which is that when you zero in on that particular dynamic, even though it is central and important to all human dynamics, you can't say that gender equality is a silo in and of itself. It's about men and women and how they live their lives. It's about everything, right? But the experience of our governance and intergovernmental mechanisms in trying to bring attention to this very critical area that was ignored for decades, that experience should be instructive to us now arguing and trying to place and trying to serve the freedom of thought, conscience, and belief agenda, because we've siloed gender equality as yet another area. Of course, it's now normalized. Everybody speaks to gender equality and how important it is, but have we realized it? Nowhere near realized it. Nowhere near it, anywhere in the world, anywhere in the world. So a certain nugget of humility could be derived from that particular way. But the question that I think Eugene is asking exceeds that to a certain extent, because that is the explanation for why we end up looking at certain rights and trying to position and give them priority. But why do we end up segregating them in the first place? Because there hasn't actually been a sustained engagement globally on the entire human rights spectrum. Invariably, in different moments in history, certain human rights are seen as very, very critical and have to be fought for and have to be defended and have to be argued and mobilized for by specific institutions and mechanisms of power. Very, very often it's been a north-south kind of thing. And what is maybe extremely distinctive about the gender equality struggle and the FoRB struggle is that there is a movement, a grassroots movement building from the South that is feeding into some of the rhetoric and the narratives and the discourses of the North. And this is some of the work that Eugene and others are doing in South Asia. But I think the issue here is the tendency to cherry pick specific rights is a very normal tendency, if you will. It's something that many governments also are more comfortable with, because if you want to hold a government accountable to the entire human rights agenda, that's a hard ask of any government, no matter how democratically positioned it is. And we're talking about the context today where this situation has got worse, as I was saying earlier. Actually, authoritarianism now is more regular, more normal. So if under normal circumstances, governments were anyway uncomfortable being confronted with the entire panorama of human rights, and if you look at some of the democratic governments today, till today, their record on the human rights of immigrants, refugees, is pretty sad, actually. Right? So we were not talking about any government in the world that has a perfect record on human rights. There is a preference for many of those governments to segregate which rights they will be able to champion, which rights they would like to be seen to champion, and which rights are particularly relevant for their particular administration. That has always been the case, and that has always been the tension between rights holders and duty bearers. And because of that fundamental tension, we see a repetitiveness in the narrative of human rights struggles, where certain administrations or certain government systems prefer to limit which aspect of the human rights agenda they will be accountable for. And as a result, the civic engagement and the resistance to that kind of limitation then engenders a broader awareness. On the one hand, if you look at the glass half full, a broader awareness on the part of many in the civic space of wait, we're forgetting this, let's organize about that, let's make sure that's on the agenda. So that's a good thing. But the glass half empty is we're constantly breaking down the human rights interdivisibility.
Yes. Yes, we need to move on, but let me just summarize. I think right now, thank you, Azza, for pointing out to us that we silo, we excise, and maybe even automize rights in the human rights discourse. But I think with the coming in play of the Sustainable Development Goals, trying to look at development from a holistic picture, it may be quite challenging. Maybe states will always try to do that, government will always try to do that through power relations and their own interests and agenda. But as we begin to engage in the development agenda, particularly in contextual local communities, I think it will be very difficult in the days to come to make excuses to try to silo or try to excise certain human rights, because you cannot talk about gender equality without looking at the religious groups, and you cannot talk about eradicating poverty if you don't look at health and environment, for example. So thank you very much for reminding us that in the development agenda, FoRB is an important component, but it cannot be at the expense of the other human rights. There must be sort of a holistic picture. What is happening right now, most likely in Asia, is that perhaps religion or freedom of religion is sort of marginalized. So that's something that I think we can interact more as we go along. But I think we move on now to Samira. Samira Gotto. I hope I got you correct, pronounce you correct. The Honorable Samira Gotto Tomawis, is it? The advocate for the people of Marawi in Philippines. She's the chairperson of the AKO BA Bakwit Incorporation, a non-profit organization that promotes and protects the right of internally displaced person. She was a member of the expanded Bangsa Moro Transition Commission, a government committee tasked with drafting the terms of the Bangsa Moro autonomy. She's a former legislative representative of women in the autonomous region in Muslim Mindanao and a member of a multi-sectoral advisory council. She was also a chevening scholar at Oxford Center for Islamic Studies in London. So another influential figure in the context of Philippines. And perhaps we'd like to hear from the Honorable Samira as to experience, particularly in relation to the Bangsa Moro issue that we seldom hear about. Over to you, Samira.
Thank you so much, Eugene. Thank you to my co-panelists and Cole and Azza for a wonderful intro, very intimidating, but yes, I do very, very agree as a gender advocate myself and a worker on the ground on the interconnectivity of things. And you know, the Philippines is very much the bad example right now of human rights, SOS. And of course, I'm sharing some notes as one person who has worked with different arrays of groups. And of course, I did tell Eugene, I'm not an academic. I was a writer. I went into the foray of government, and we want to know what is this one of the longest conflicts actually that we often do not really associate with the longest conflict is really right in near to us, second largest archipelago in the world, Philippines, and one of the major democracies supposedly of Asia, and yet it has hosted one of the longest conflicts and peace talks hosted by several countries of the world, no, to include Indonesia, Libya, Malaysia, at least for the last talks, and so many monitors and donors. And so, talking of interconnectivity, how do you actually even account how much of the money has gone to spending for conflict? So, seeing that it's one of the longest, 40 years, half a century of peace agreement. So, I'm actually part of this organization that's working on interfaith. We did craft modules for young people on interfaith Muslim Christian dialogue to include indigenous peoples. So we have this term called tribe people, TRIPE, tribe people, three peoples. And it's a long history of work with young people, and nitpicking and reflecting on that, on how we tend to just look on certain things as separate. We would say that state actors, our counterparts in government, would actually do that by separating peace process to its decisions on security and saying that it will be a security resolution. That will really muddle the human rights discourse in itself. Example, our history tells us that we have had this stereotype of the Muslim South. The Philippines is Christian majority, and the southern part is Muslim minority, where the conflict is predominant. And we have this long 300 years of Spanish rule that has left us this legacy of the moral stereotype. This is the Muslim stereotype as that jihadist carrying a sword, fighting the majority Christian, not believing in this Christian government, not wanting to enroll in its schools, not wanting his children to obtain Philippine schooling. And we still have a much unregistered population of minorities in our Philippine register. Look at that. The caliber, the story of the 45 caliber is that it was put in the Philippines by American colonizers so that it can fight the sword-yielding Moros. And so the Bangsamoro people are defined by those who have fought the Spanish, the Americans, 40 years, 300 years of Spanish, 40 years of American, and then the Japanese. They were predominantly in the South, in Mindanao. From 1903, as you see, towards 1 century, you've seen that they've minoritized. They've traveled, they've left. And this is one of the effects of the loss of government in encouraging the northern part of our country, the northern Christian majority, to be traveling and taking lands with incentives, incentivizing ownership of lands in the southern part of our country. And the Muslims also moving towards the north with of course, conflict happening. So you see the numbers, and we were actually, the Muslims in the South were actually classified by the Americans as wild, uncivilized tribes. So as a law student, I would actually have seen some of my law books carry the name Mohammedans, people who believed in the Prophet Muhammad rather than Muslim peoples even. So they were wild, they were uncivilized, they didn't have literature, Islamic literature or tribal literature. It wasn't documented. Now, one of the more impacts of this discourse is really the expense on conflict. And we've had a long, costly martial law as well, 1970s, under the Marcos dictatorship. And they say it's the Moro war again, the national government fighting the Moros, specifically Marawi, Sulu, where now the current anti-terror war operations are happening, this is where the spark of revolution to the Marawi and the Bangsamoro Muslim South was the spark that led for the Philippine martial law to be declared, and therefore the whole country. Therefore, the whole country. So the poorest part of our country is the deadliest part of our country. The non-developed part of our country is the most costly in expenses in the country. You're expending much money in fighting a very, very long war. And so expecting to set up a government is really, really very challenging. And also building relations among the Muslims, Christians, and where I'm from, this is Marawi. This is the most recent urban warfare 3 years ago, where the ISIS / working with local multi-group affected Marawi City, the Islamic city of the Philippines, and to reinforce the stereotype, it landed in the Islamic city, the most non-commercial part of our country. There's no cinemas, there's no libraries, there's no commercial. It is not commercial. It's city, but it's non-city. It's non-urban, very non-urban. And so the fighting happened, and 500,000 were displaced in different parts of the country. It is one of the deadliest destruction in recent history for the whole country. And you would be familiar, the American funding, the Russian technology, all this foreign funding expended or given for supposedly rehabilitation. And comes COVID, additionally, it backtracked all the infrastructure. After 3 years, now coming 4th year, we have had no return of refugees or internally displaced persons to ground zero. So this is a challenge of the government of a so-called Bangsamoro. So I'd like to mention the Bangsamoro, of course, because it's a law that came into place after all these 4 decades of talks between government and Moro fronts. First with the Moro National Liberation Front, Nur Miswari, and now brokered by Indonesia, and now with Malaysia, this Bangsamoro Autonomous Government. And the inclusion of systematic provisions on recognizing the Christian settlers and the indigenous peoples are laid down in several provisions. Okay, so as part of the drafting, we were actually, we actually had to push this, of course. We were part of this committee that was drafting. And these are some of the provisions to have a justice system that recognizes also the courts that are not the Islamic courts, the main courts of our country. So that would be where the Christians would go, or the settlers as we call them. And it would also recognize the freedom of choice of all peoples. Of course, these are all copied from our Philippine Constitution as well. We would have Christian representation in the parliament, or the settlers will be represented in the governing body. They would have seats. Indigenous peoples would have seats. They would have the participation of our women. Right now, it's in a transition. Our government in the Bangsamoro is in a transition. So we have also Christian representation in the Bangsamoro. We're talking 4 million people, and less than 1 million or so would be Christians and indigenous peoples. What I'm positive about in this setting is that there is a strong history of civil society working on interfaith. So we have hiccups along the way. There's fights of interfaith. There's fights, of a Sulu bombing of a church, or a Zamboanga church bombing, killings of policemen attributed again to extremism or extremist factors or elements. But there's a long history of interfaith, and I would think this is a countervailing force to all the historical lack of cohesion that is still there, historical mistrust between Muslims and Christians. There's a big history of people who are young at that, who are working on interfaith. There's a college or institute of peace building that is set up in the island of Mindanao in the south. And there's a strong presence also of the northern civil society that advocate using media for peace and juxtaposing it with human rights. And the real challenge really right now is for this presidency to carry on human rights as a gain of this peace agreement, recognizing both the majority Bangsamoro Muslim and the Christian minority who will have to battle it out in a political process in elections to come, in the very first elections of this Bangsamoro setup. I'm also positive that there is a very big young population that will be a democratic human rights force that would provide the narrative, that would provide the storytelling, that would provide the political parties the necessary form and content to fight dynasties and people who have traditional mindsets in a region that has not had a strong history of democratic traditions, not having had elections that were not within the control of a national government. So we have a very weak political party set up here in this government. And the civil society also from within this society is at best very weak. We have weak media. So there is not much interconnectivity. Literally, Wi-Fi digital divide is very real. But with these elements that I'm talking about, a law in place, young people, interfaith, civil society, children at my back, a big youth bulge, children, highest fertility rates in this country are here. I would think that development might be slow. Government is in place. Cohesion policies to be put in place. We are looking at positive times ahead. But with Duterte, President Duterte, you know that human rights is not as priority. We're looking beyond a Duterte presidency and a Biden outlook, President US Biden outlook that would influence how government of the Philippines is spending also for Mindanao, since US is one of its biggest spenders for humanitarian, etc., police reform, etc. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yes, thank you. Now, thank you, Samira. Just for maybe for our audience, I'd just like to ask a follow-up question. You have shared that a lot of it will depend on the political infrastructure. That's understandable. In this, now that you have this Bangsamoro law in place, Christians there seems to be quite happy with it. The Muslims are, of course, happy, the MILF and so on and so forth. Now, in this particular setup, where do you think the Bangsamoro Autonomous Region, where do you think for that region, the UN Sustainable Development Goals, the agenda, SDGs agenda, the 17 goals and so on, and the many targets, 150 over targets or so, where do you think it will fit into this autonomous region? Is there any particular emphasis right now, given the weak political infrastructure, looking beyond Duterte and so on?
That's why this platform is very important, because of there's no longer the monitors that are in place. There were 6-7 members, including Muhammadiyah, including international CR, Conciliation Resources of UK. There were monitors of national from other countries that were guarding or looking over the peace process in Mindanao, in the southern part, in the Philippines. And so I would think that this hand-holding between national government, which is existing for 100 years as a national government with all sophisticated infrastructure already in place, and with its sophisticated armed forces, the armed forces being centralized in the national, that is not within the jurisdiction of the local, that would be a hand-holding way, hand-holding, how it can national be able to monitor without having to interfere in the autonomous processes of political strengthening, capacitation for this region. So it remains that we still need to have hand-holding in terms of infrastructure build-up, but at the same time have to also retain our political capacity so that we can influence our communities in complying also with SDGs, and telling women that they need to already practice family planning in the way that Islam will advise us. So there's this balance, and the national local languaging and mishmashing that has to happen along the way, so the SDGs also can be well accepted indigenously and at the same time handheld and mentored by the national.
Okay, Okay, that's good. You have given, I think, our audience a bit more insight on the very unique situation on the Bangsa Moro. Not many people, I think, can understand that. What I'm going to do here is that I think I'm just going to pause for a little while before we ask Honorable Kelvin to come and share, because Kelvin will be sharing more from the parliamentary aspect. But perhaps just to pause here and return back to Azza and Samira. We have 3 questions that have been posted, and I see those questions, some of which are very interesting questions. Perhaps I'd like to highlight to direct these questions to Azza from one Joseph Tong Kiang. The question reads as follows: I agree that there is a rise of authoritarianism and the importance of religious institutions for FoRB and human rights. So that is a great. Then religious institutions are being excluded in the non-governmental works for human rights. How should religious institutions be strengthened while there is a question of neutrality in non-governmental works? Now, of course, as I direct this question to Azza, I would also like to add that even within the UN documents, in the Sustainable Development Goals of 2030, the 17 goals and the 150 world targets, religion or religious freedom is rarely mentioned, even as a target or a measurement. Perhaps you'd like to comment on this, while we note the importance of seeing a holistic picture, but the fact here is that institutions or more secular institution or non-religious institution seem to be excluding FoRB or religion away from that agenda.
Yeah. It's a very good question. Thank you very much, Professor Yap, and thank you to Mr. Joseph for posing it. I think that we need to keep 2 things in mind. The first is that actually religion as such isn't mentioned anywhere in the Sustainable Development Goals. So it's not just that we're concerned about freedom of religion and belief not being clearly laid out. The entire narrative of religions, even culture, which is supposed to include religion, that was a struggle in the formation in the pre-2015 attempts to set the development goal agenda with the governments. It was already a massive struggle to try to put a goal for culture there. And of course, as you can see, it didn't make it through, largely because I think governments find that this is where it gets particularly iffy and tricky. And for some reason, culture isn't seen as that relevant. So therefore work backwards. Religion you don't want to have a goal on that. And therefore, obviously, FoRB won't be featuring. So that particular gap is very much there. But on the other hand, the Sustainable Development Goals agenda are the epitome of all human rights goals, objectives, enacted in very clear goals, set up in very clear goals with very specific indicators. And by accepting them, 193 governments are actually signing on to the fact that they are holding themselves accountable to that continuum of human rights, not just to 1 or 2 or 3 or 18 human rights, but to the continuum of human rights, because this is the 17 Sustainable Development Goals enact the continuum of the human rights agenda, right? So it may not be mentioned specifically, but all human rights are very much enacted through those goals. So with that in mind, I think the question then is how should religious institutions be strengthened given that particular balance within civic society? Well, first of all, I think secular civil society is due for a wake-up call about religious civil society. Because right now, secular civil society has been incredibly exclusive of religious domains and contexts, not just religious institutions, but especially religious institutions. So secular civil society needs a bit of a wake-up call to realize that it can become stronger, it will become stronger with the inclusion of the religious spaces and realms within it. The second thing that needs to be very much affirmed, and you see this in, I think there are many examples around the world, but the civil rights movement in the United States, Martin Luther King Jr. days, and today is a very good example and illustration of how the inclusion of the religious into the broad civic space, of how much more powerful civil society is with religious actors in it. It's a very good example of that. And I think we need to see and identify those examples where when the religious was part of the civic the movement of resilience building and an opposition to oppression and ability to claim rights becomes much more powerful. So this is something that we definitely have to do as secular civil society actors. This will mean that the religious institutions in particular, which invariably make this claim to exceptionalism, no, we're not normal civil society, we have a special relationship with God, or whatever the mantra is, but there is this notion of they're kind of different. That means, frankly, religious institutions and religious actors also have to become a bit more humble and accept that they are part of that amazing, thriving, vibrant, incredibly complex network of civil society, and maybe just come down a notch from the claim to exceptionalism that they have. The third thing that actually needs to happen is we need to begin to look at which religious institutions are already working together and committed to doing so on the entire Sustainable Development Goals agenda. And hello, Religions for Peace is right here. The Sustainable Development Goals are Religions for Peace's strategic priorities for the next few years. What is Religions for Peace? It's all the religious institutions coming together and have been doing so for the last 5 decades to work together towards realizing universal peace as the UN defines it, which is everybody's interest. So we don't have to go too far. We do need to identify which religious, interreligious actors are already with a track record of convening the religious institutions and already committed to the support of freedom of thought, conscience, and belief as part of the larger fabric of the Universal Human Rights Agenda, which is what informs the Sustainable Development Goals. Find the partners and work with them. What is happening is a lot of people try to go create their own alternative entity. Certain governments decide they want to create their own alternative entity. That's fine, but that's not really helpful if you've already got actors in this space who are standing alongside one another and have an experience in doing so. Because it takes knowledge, it takes wisdom to learn how to work together as religious actors. It takes remarkable experience over decades to learn how to work together as religious institutions. It doesn't come by virtue of being a religious institution. Never. Because religious institutions look after themselves. Religious NGOs look after themselves. Those who do come together and actively serve together in partnership, those are very special and build a very special set of experiences that are very difficult to replicate elsewhere in the world. So we must look at where the experience resides. In the Holy Quran and my tradition, there is a verse that says, look to those with learning. Learning meaning experience. Learning meaning having practiced and found out. Look to those of learning. We must do so with the religious institutions and those who convene them. Those are places of learning. We must find them, we must work with them actively as secular civil society, as governmental counterparts. But the attempt to create siloed new initiatives, new endeavors, new NGOs, new whatever, I don't think it's very helpful. But that's what we need to do if we want to strengthen the religious institutions' capacities to collaborate actively and champion freedom of thought, conscience, and belief. And it is one of the 6 top strategic priorities of Religions for Peace. And we're standing there saying, hello, anybody, can you work with us, please? Secular civil society, governments, whatever, would you work with us? We're here.
Okay, thank you. Perhaps just to add on a little bit, in our experience in Malaysia, one of the things that we found in terms of working together, adopting the Sustainable Development Goal is they are already existing organizations coming together. But to recognize the importance and the role of religion, the SDG have 17 goals. They created what you call unofficially in their own perspective, goal number 18. And that goal number 18 is spirituality. It's their way of trying to bring religion into the agenda, and they gather together as religious institutions, religious entities to bring this agenda of the SDG forward. Now, perhaps Azza or even Samira, you can comment a little bit about this because the role of spirituality is rarely mentioned. I've not seen it mentioned at all in any of the documents, but perhaps it's something that could be important. It could be a very creative way of trying to bring this role of religious or religious institution to be part of that movement to contribute to the common good. Any comments from the 2 speakers?
Yeah, that's true, of course, Eugene. It's wonderful that documents are existing and there's commitments, public commitments. The disconnect really, Eugene, is that you have a strong public posturing on on respect for religions, for supporting civil society, and on the other hand, you're going to conduct war operations on that community. So the disconnect is still existing. You're not connecting that social protection is as much valuable as spirituality. Poverty is as much valuable as spirituality, and spirituality has to interconnect all elements. So we can't have a government talking about spirituality and at the same time killing its own people through its war operations to minorities, and conducting them without community engagement, without validation, without stronger intelligence work, as we have seen in accusing people of being terrorists in our society, in my community. So that's my problem. You conduct a peace talks, you've concluded peace talks, and yet you're warring and identifying recklessly so-called terrorists without having transitional justice and all the necessary justice measures in place, reparations in place. And what of spirituality? Spirituality and the leaderships themselves that are founding and standing on spirituality can't even muster enough confidence to traverse the very complicated language and work of assertion of governance and assertion of their role in this kind of discourse on security and intelligence and human rights. So they have to interface. They have to get that confidence. The spiritual leaders have to be, as ma'am said, as a humble enough, open enough to find that spirituality and human rights are as much sisters and brothers, are twin.
Okay. All right. Good perspective from the Philippines. I'd like to just direct one supplementary question that I am looking at from the question and answer mechanism. And this is in relation to what Aza has shared just now regarding the need for religious groups, religious institutions to work together. Now, the question here is working together, does it mean compromise faith? And if it's not compromising faith, how then are we to do it? Aza, would like to address the question?
Yes, I actually tried to address it live and ended up pressing the wrong button. So I'm very sorry, because it's an extremely important question. Working together is what we see happening in the legacy of Religions for Peace. It means actually interreligious councils where religious leaders representing the religious institutions and religious leaders representing their communities come together on very specific projects and initiatives. Some of them have to do with health. Many of them have to do with education. Now they're all actually serving together with their communities to provide food, medicine, rotational services for people who are living on their own, finding income, pooling the resources to give income to those who have lost their incomes. Very, very practical things that everybody needs in a society, regardless of their religion. These religious leaders and their institutions are coming together to serve their communities in those ways. No religious principle is being ignored. On the contrary, they are realizing the primary prerogative of faith, which is to serve especially those who are most vulnerable. That is what religions tell us, no matter what they are, no matter where they are. Religions demand upon us to serve one another, to serve especially the most vulnerable. When religions serve the most vulnerable, and they are the oldest social service providers known to humankind, religious institutions are actually the oldest development in humanitarian governance that's ever been there. Some of them are the oldest governments that have ever been there. So when they actually do this work, they are not going against the religious precepts. They're actually living out and enacting their religious principles and convictions. When they do this together, they are realizing the common divine element. How did we come up with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948? We came up because it was the values common to all religions. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights is built on the values common to all religions, meaning that when you work together for human rights, you're not working to prioritize one religion over the other or one set of values over the other. You're working to realize the divine in all missions, but you're enacting it very practically through laws and regulations. International human rights law is the best example we have of a legislative notion and document that convenes, that enacts all the values of all religious traditions and faith communities around the world. This is our practical living how-to legislative accountability notion, international human rights law. We need to understand that to be able to say, work backwards to say that when religious institutions work together, they don't compromise on anything. They actually live out their very basic premise and knowledge. That's just the way that it is. We seem to think that religious institutions, because many religious leaders will try to claim exceptionalism of their own faith tradition or their own religious institution or their own religious NGO for that matter, that attempt to carve out this exclusive, this is us and we're better, and this is our parameters and we're better, to me, that's not religious. That's just institutions doing their usual business. And it's a business. Because the minute you try to carve out territory, whether it's spiritual territory or whether it's practical territory, whether it's financial territory, you're doing business. And that's not, in my humble opinion, that's not what religions are supposed to be about. So that 18th goal you were talking about makes a lot of sense. Makes even more sense if that goal is mainstreamed into all the other existing goals so that we can see how it is and we can ensure that the religious institutions, religious NGOs, religious communities, religious leaders without institutions are all able to work together to realize all of these goals. That is us realizing the divine commitment and obligation of all faith traditions.
Thank you, Azhar. I like your last point, putting that 18 goal into all the other goals and underlining it and working through it as a whole, you know? So something that is helpful. At this stage, while we are talking about goals and putting it into all the other goals and putting it as part of a working structure, I'd like to invite our third and final speaker, the Honorable Kelvin Yee, who is a member of Parliament for the government, for the Parliament of Malaysia, to address us. Kelvin serves as a member of Parliament of Malaysia, representing what is called the Bandar Kuching constituency. Currently, he also sits on the Parliamentary Budget Select Committee and acts as the treasurer of the bipartisan all-party parliamentary group Malaysia, APBGM, on sustainable development goals. So we do have this all-parliamentary group that consists of both the opposition and ruling coalition coming together to promote the SDG. And before politics, he was actually a civil society activist, particularly in the area of providing free medical aid to the poor and disaster-stricken city. Now, I've known Kelvin for many years, even before he became a politician. He was an interesting young man, and perhaps I now would like to invite him to actually address us. And also perhaps, Kelvin, as you address this the issue of parliamentary structures, governmental institutional structure, you would also like to address this particular issue that was raised by one of our audience, the idea, this notion of the separation between church and state, the mosque and state, the gurdwaras and the state, and that religion should not be politicized. How do you see, as a member of parliament, as a politician, seeing this notion of the separation of mosque and state, church and state, and so on? Over to you, Kevin.
Thank you so much, Eugene. Thank you so much for having me, and it's really been an enriching session together with all the different, as I myself am inspired and provoked in terms of a lot of the things that's been shared. Well, as Eugene said, I serve as a member of parliament for. So in terms of the context of Malaysia, when we talk about politics and religion, of course, highly debated because of different things. How things are very intertwined in Malaysia, even though freedom of religion technically is enshrined under the federal constitution, and of course, rights of the minorities are clearly stated in that constitution. However, as I mentioned just now, I mean, in the context of Malaysia, when we talk about religion, it is always very intertwined with ethnicity, and such discourse to a certain extent sensitive, as I said, cultural sensitivity, obstacles that we deal with every time we talk about this issue. I think as a role as a member of parliament, as an MP, what place, in my view, the question that was put just now is a very common question that everybody says. Should religion be separated from the state, or should religion be part of politics in the state? My personal opinion is, of course, there has to be a separation, that no one religion should be put superior, even though they may be an official or religion of a federation, but that does not mean the rights of this are not clear of. However, one's personal faith can determine one's personal conduct or personal values, on personal principles, as well as the way they practice the politics that they do. So as an MP, as I mentioned just now, we need to exemplify all those values, all those principles that we so-called preach or the so-called believe. The fact of the matter, when we take the oath as a member of parliament, our oath is to protect the federal constitution, which of course, which means protecting the rights of freedom of religion, conscience, thoughts and belief, and also all the other human rights that is needed. So besides that, I think every government, I think in Malaysia, it is also our role to make sure that there are political structures that supports and protects this, to monitor, and also to make sure that there are no laws or policies that are being passed in Parliament that will infringe all these issues. So specifically in Parliament, just now you did mention that I'm part of the Budget Select Committee. However, this committee has recently been taken away. I think they're building a new committee in terms of economy. So I'm not too sure where I will be next, but then I'm looking forward to be part of it. But one of the committees, the Parliamentary Select Committee that was formed, newly formed, not the members are not yet being selected, but newly formed is a Parliament Select Committee on fundamental liberties and constitutional rights. I think this itself covers issues of FoRB as well as other important human rights issues. And this is a very important, as I said, select committee to monitor the executive, to monitor the government, to make sure that laws and actions being taken by the executive has been passed do not infringe all these important rights. Of course, on a personal level, as I mentioned, religion plays an important part in terms of how we practice our politics. It is our responsibility as a member of parliament to maintain certain level of decorum in our speech, as well as our actions, not to stoke one person against the other. Of course, because Malaysia in context especially is a very multicultural, multi-religious area. Because if you're following the news in Malaysia, we have seen examples of this, even speeches made in parliament that has put down or dismissed certain religions of minorities. So this is other things that we as MPs need to stand up to, or if we see any infringement or any things that is wrong, we need to make a strong stand and make sure that things are set right, especially in parliament. So in the politics that we practice, I think one due to the whole nature of Malaysia's multiculturalism, multi-religionism, and how our constituency are being drawn. The sad thing is a lot of the constituency are separated by race, ethnicity, and to a certain extent, religion. So I think it's also a responsibility of our politicians in Malaysia, especially, to practice certain decorum, to have a bigger picture, not to practice politics of expediency, to stoke sensitive issues, to break people up just to win votes, but actually have a bigger picture on how to address common issues, find middle grounds, to build a nation as a whole. So I think I'll just leave it at there. Any questions, you can throw it to me, and I can even share the things we do under the APPGM for SDGs later.
Yes, thank you, Kevin. Perhaps to follow up, why don't you share a bit about the APPGM? As a member of parliament, you obviously have an important role to bring institutional structures or put in place policies and structures, mechanisms that will be able to promote the SDG, particularly in relation to communities that are what you call in need of peace building, as you say, to prevent the politicians from trying to incite or stoke division and so on.
I think that's a very important role in a sense. I mean, when we talk about freedom of religion, we talk about religion in things that we practice. I really believe that our spirituality, I like that whole Go 18 kind of thing, that the spirituality actually is it plays an important role in peace building and bringing our focus back to what the real agenda is of UN SDGs. I mean, we're talking about 17 core values, but then it shouldn't be seen as one mutually exclusive of one another. Every single goal is interconnected. And in order to achieve one, we need to kind of cover all, especially. And for this reason, I think in the context of Malaysia, it is important. I think since last year, one of the parliamentary reforms that we did under the previous administration was to kind of institutionalize a group called the All Party Parliamentary Group, It's a bipartisan, transpartisan group where members of both the opposition and the government is in, where we sit together, we plan together, and so far we have 10 different constituencies around Malaysia, where we will focus on localizing these UN SDG goals into the ground. Because I said we can have a nice intellectual discussions on how these things can be done. But once you look at the local context and how different things, different areas are, it's always different. There is no one size fits all or blanket strategy for the whole country. So that is where the inputs of every parliamentarian and also the buy-in of every parliamentarian from different political divide to focus on that middle ground. Because you see now, religion, I mean, human rights basically is values common to all religion. And I mean, the faith that I believe in is says that we need to be good news to the poor and the marginalized and the vulnerables. So what is good news to the poor? Good news to the poor is when we address their needs, when we address their hurts. And this is where this APPGM intends to bring that focus back instead of the divisive politics that a lot of people tend to practice. So I mean, like what we address, we address core needs. We address core needs of the poor. COVID-19 is, of course, an unprecedented issue that it's not just a health crisis, it's an economic crisis, and it's like a stress test. It basically increased the intensity and the urgent need of us to address all these UN SDGs, like education, poverty, health, and also peace. And that's where this APPGM actually localizes on the level that we are in. And I can give you examples in my constituency. For example, my constituency is a major urban area, but one of the issues we face is, of course, urban poverty, and especially slums in the areas. So our projects are what we call slum incubators, where we try to uplift the socio-economic status of the people, addressing, in my area, three main core issues: economy, in terms of their jobs, upskilling and reskilling them if they lose their jobs during COVID-19. Number two is health, in terms of making sure that these marginalized are not left behind in terms of getting proper healthcare screening, healthcare treatment, and even COVID tests and COVID education. So like last in October, I had a government agency to do mammograms and pap smears to make sure the women are not left behind in terms of this of this important test. There was an elderly Iban lady. Iban is one of the ethnic in Malaysia. She was so happy. She says, "Thank you for coming straight to my house to provide this healthcare." It says that nobody has come straight to our house to do this kind of things. So that's the health, and of course the third is education. Address the digital gap, education gap between the rich and the poor, especially in the urban area, especially now that schools are closed due to the restrictive interventions due to COVID-19. So again, how does spirituality play a role in all this? Basically, it's in everything. Let's say everything is every UN SDG is interrelated. The importance is finding the middle ground. At the end, there are more things that we are similar rather than things that are different. If we look inclusively at the issues that we face in our difference, we will continuously fight, or we stoke each other's anxieties. Every ethnicity, every religion has their own anxieties, but it is our decision to whether to stoke it, to create division, or actually to look outside, to look at a bigger picture and do something that's bigger than ourselves, and find that middle ground and address what is important and the core calling of all religions, which is to serve and to protect the vulnerable and, of course, the marginalized.
Yeah, good. Earlier there was a question addressed to us by one of the audience, Dato' Denison, and I think this is a question that is at the heart of both Kelvin and Samira. The role of young people today, youth or young people today. Everywhere we see, even within this COVID pandemic season, from Black Lives Matters to parts of Myanmar, to parts of places like Nigeria, Sudan, and then over even here in Indonesia, Malaysia, we see the rise of young people's movement trying to claim in some ways, in the way perhaps they know how to, their freedom and their will to want to do something or to make a change that is relevant. So really the question here is that for both Samira and Kevin, in what way can you suggest, very practical ways, can you suggest to our audience, ways in which we can actually mobilize this young people's movement, this youth movement, so that they can play their role in the SDG? And as you say, undergirding this whole SDG is the idea of religion making contribution to common good, the spirituality informing us that we are all part of humanity towards this good for everyone. Any ideas from you all? Samira,
Sweet.
any one of you can go first?
Honorable Kelvin, is it okay?
Ladies first.
Ladies first.
It's precisely being used that they're the actual change agents that we'd like to facilitate the dialogue processes. And it's wonderful that we have 1995 reference to from the United Nations, or this global document that says young people are critical in development, or young people are part of the processes of decision making. So they really need to be part of this, especially with the digital age and being keyboard warriors, keyboard activators of conferences, summits. And we've had this very big upsurge of pandemic support system among them, young people in the Philippines. And the problem is the gap of the spirituality. They seem to be intimidated with these stories, or this narrative, or this topic about spirituality. So I think how we can bridge that fear for them to overcome, this so-called maybe wall or fence that they see, that they're not capable enough, they're not confident enough to talk about spirituality, something that I try to inject as a youth lecture to young people. I was going to share this one slide only on this one of these documents that I tell them is about being part of this discourse in media. Literacy really requires us to be actively involved in using media to be a platform. So for peace, interfaith dialogue, this is a wonderful time, sirs and ma'ams, to be in this age of COVID, of reflection, of time online, to be finding friends from Africa, in Southeast Asia, in the United States, in the West, for the different cultures and religions to come together online at the very cheapest way possible. Wonderful.
Kevin, do you like to say something?
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much. I think we always say this buzzword that we need a whole society approach to deal with COVID or whatever. And this whole society includes the young people. And I strongly, strongly believe young people are not just the leaders of tomorrow, but they're the leaders of today. So actually, young people, especially if you look at throughout history, movements and change throughout the world are always led by young people, because of not just the energy or passion that young people bring, but the idealism. So in terms of spirituality, I've spoken to so many young people, and I've noticed that most young people, they look beyond divisive sentiments, they look beyond spiritual religious segregation, because they want to see practical things done to make their things better. So the things that I always challenge them, I mean, on a faith and a spiritual level, is how can your faith, or how can my faith empower each and every one of you people way for you to be, I mean, history makers, world changers, and nation builders in where you are. I mean, what you have in your hands, youth, what the knowledge. I mean, we are in the most educated generation throughout history. So how can we challenge these young people to take the knowledge that they have, the digital skills that they have, to make a difference in where they are? And actually, this reason now COVID-19 is actually the best period, because the needs are all intensified. And young people actually play an important role to address that. Even in the digital gap, which is something that I'm very concerned about, between the rich and the poor, the urban and the rurals. But young people, I mean, they're so technically smart in terms of this, and how can we be creative to address this? So I think young people are looking for practical things, even in their spirituality. They do not just want to have a faith, but faith that is not by works, or I mean faith that is not put in action. So that's is our role as well as leaders, to inspire them, to encourage them, to guide them, to mold them, and to push them towards this whole society approach that we will.
Okay, we have about 6 minutes, 5 to 6 minutes of left, and we have managed to explicate some take-home points for us. Namely, we have seen that as far as freedom of religion is concerned, as it's relevant to the Sustainable Development Goals (SDG), it should not be seen in silo. We should attempt to be holistic, because human rights is essentially indivisible. It's integrated with one another. So if we want to bring that whole, to actualize the whole agenda of the SDG, we need to take what is called an integrated approach. Not a particularized approach, but an integrated approach. And in that process, we have also established that it's very important to have what is called spirituality behind it, the spirituality behind it, you know. And of course, as we engage the young people, we cannot escape from the fact that we are in the digital media era, and that's very important. It can be good or bad. So with this last few minutes, could the speakers share with us one practical point that our audience can take home as they think about SDG being part of the whole human rights approach, of being integrated with spirituality and religion playing its role to bring about a common good in this new era of digital technology? One practical suggestion or idea which our audience can take home.
Yeah, I'd really like to affirm it's one-liners that I share to young people: books, not bullets; teachers, not tanks; not terrorism, but transformation. It's a world of change and dynamism. It's elders taking from the young, young being also elders themselves. It's really a generation of how you can make and break or unbreak things. So it's wonderful that we had this 7 months or almost a year of introspection, and this platform actually touched on a very, very divide of spirituality and the real world of development. Thank you for this forum.
Kevin, anything to say? Anything to add?
I think it is important. We must learn how to find common grounds. We must learn how to find things that connect us. We are stronger as a bigger unit, and it's something that we need to. I mean, even in the context of freedom of religion, and also dialogue and finding things. So we need to find common grounds, focus on what really matters, and always use the core issues to serve, to protect, and to love the people that are marginalized and vulnerable.
Thank you. 3 minutes, perhaps it's only fair that I hand this forum to my co-organizer, Professor Cole Durham. We have worked very closely together for the past few years. Perhaps we'd like to hear from Cole. Cole was the moderator for the first session on FoRB and development. Anything you wish to add in closing?
I've found that two immediately prior statements very moving, and I'm going to go back and listen to them and write them down in more care. As I've listened to this, I am struck by some of Aza's points at the beginning about the provocative points. And I think one of the challenges is, and it is a challenge of FoRB, that we need to be a little less afraid of difference and recognize that we have huge problems, and sometimes different people are going to come at them and solve them in different ways. That doesn't mean that we can't be united in efforts, and we shouldn't strive to be divided in efforts. But we should also recognize some of the strengths of pluralism that are simply that different people will see things differently. And I think we need to bear that in mind along with everything else that we're thinking about. This is part of why different people will put priority on different issues. It's as much as we'd like to have everyone have a comprehensive approach to everything, that doesn't always work, but it is an ideal that we should work toward. We should try to learn as much as we can from each other. And I welcome these seminars that we've had sponsored by SEAFoRB, because one of the realities is religious difference, while it's been one of the huge problems of humanity, religious groups have now had a lot of experience dealing with difference, and they're actually quite good at it. They're not perfect, and they cause problems sometimes, but we've learned a lot, and I think we should welcome that. So thank you to our panelists, and thank you to you, Eugene, for putting this together. And I think it's been very interesting for all of us.
Thank you, Cole. So in closing, thank you again to everyone who is present. Just as Cole tried to close this session and bring this together, one word that or one expression that comes to mind. In this modern world, or some people call it a postmodern world, we really need to embrace what I call unity in diversity. There is diversity and we have to recognize that, but in the diversity, we have to find that common ground, whether it's in FoRB issues. There will be times where FoRB will actually be contradictory or run into tensions with, say, gender equality issues and so on. But really, while respecting the diversity of it, we do really need to be able to coerce together in an integrated fashion. Otherwise, the development agenda will be a very far-reaching in. Something for us to think about as we move forward. And thank you once again to everyone. I hope that this conversation, it is not intended to be the all and all to resolve all the challenges, all the issues, but it is certainly a first of the starting point to the many conversations that we have. So I hope that through this, after this, we can bring these conversations into what you call not just the regional level, but also to bring it into the country level where specific contexts actually make a difference. And we do look forward to more of this conversation, in particular in a more contextualized fashion consideration. Thank you once again. It's 5:30. Thank you for those of you who have been listening and following to be with us. And the questions that have been asked has contributed to this very good, interesting discussion. Thank you. God bless all of you.
Thank you very much.
And thank you to our speakers.